I wanted to ask you, Professor Mearsheimer, about Israel's role in all of this. Interestingly enough, despite being incredibly passionate about restarting the war, Israel was never in favor of the MOU, was never in favor of talks with Iran, wanted the war that lasted 40 days to continue on with no pause. But they have been sidelined almost in many respects in this tit for tat that you describe. There hasn't been many reports, if any, of Israeli involvement in these strikes. And I'm curious on what you believe Israel's role is right now. What is its current situation, given the fact that it has just said, Netanyahu has said, that they're not going to withdraw. There will be no withdrawal from Lebanon, from Syria, despite reports that Trump has wanted this. And they have been the preeminent champions of this war, yet appear to be, at least for now, looking at it from the sidelines.
Yeah, this is a great question. This is an issue that doesn't get a lot of attention these days. The Israelis, in a way, have been sidelined in terms of the discourse about the ongoing conflict between the United States and Iran. And it's paradoxical because the Israelis played such an important role in getting the United States involved in this war, and they played such an important role in the 40-day bombing campaign. But now they don't seem to matter much in terms of the U.S. Iran conflict. A couple points. One is, I think the Israelis understand that if they get involved in the fight, they then become a target for Iranian ballistic missiles and Iranian cruise missiles. And it's very important to understand that if you go back to the 40-day war, although the Israelis went to enormous lengths to hide the fact that their country was really clobbered by all of those Iranian missiles and drones, the fact is they were clobbered. We now know that. So the Israelis are not anxious to get back in the fight and become a giant magnet for Iranian ballistic missiles and drones. From their point of view, it's much better if the Iranians are firing at Bahrain, Kuwait, and Jordan and not at Israel. And it's better from an Israeli point of view if they can pass the buck to the United States to do the heavy lifting in terms of damaging or weakening Iran. So what the Israelis are doing is sitting on the sideline, and they have passed the buck. And this is in the context of the U.S. Iran conflict. The next point I would make is that what they really care about at this point in time is Lebanon, and to a lesser extent, Syria. And they want to fight against Hezbollah and badly damage, if not defeat, Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. And by staying out of the Iran-U.S. fight, or staying out of a direct fight with Iran, that frees them up to concentrate on dealing with Hezbollah. And as you know well, Danny, they are up to their eyeballs in alligators in terms of dealing with Hezbollah in southern Iran. Hezbollah is another formidable adversary. So the Israelis prefer to concentrate on southern Lebanon. And of course, they're also interested in taking territory and consolidating their position in southern Syria as well. Now, let me make one additional point on this whole subject. Going back to the Memorandum of Understanding, we've talked a lot about Article 5, which deals with the Strait, but Article 1 deals with Lebanon. And you want to remember, this is the first article in the memorandum. It's quite clear that the Iranians wanted this to be the first article. It deals with Lebanon. And the Iranians maintain that the fighting has to stop in Lebanon. And they also maintain that the Israelis have to get out of southern Lebanon. And of course, the Israelis have made it clear they have no intention of getting out of southern Lebanon or getting out of southern Syria. I think, Danny, when we get back to negotiating again, when President Trump gets back to negotiating again with the Iranians, that the Iranians are going to play tougher this time on the southern Lebanon issue than they did last time. I think after the 17 June Memorandum of Understanding was signed, it looked like the Iranians were willing to look the other way on the issue of Israel abandoning southern Lebanon. I think that was the one issue that the Iranians did not appear to be committed to defending. I would imagine the next time you have a negotiation, that what you're going to see is that the Iranians are going to play hardball with the Americans on the presence of Israel in southern Lebanon. And I think the Iranians are likely to say, we're not going to negotiate until you get the Israelis out of southern Lebanon, period, end of story. Now, I'm not saying that's axiomatically going to happen, but my sense is that the Iranians are going to be tougher customers to deal with moving forward than they were when we were in the process of putting together the June 17 Memorandum of Understanding, which is consistent with my argument, Danny, that with the passage of time, the coercive leverage that the Iranians have increases. In other words, the balance of coercive leverage between the United States and the Iranians moves in Iran's direction as time goes by. And that, of course, is what's happening. So I wouldn't be surprised if next time we see the Iranians playing, acting in a tougher way with regard to southern Lebanon and the Israeli military presence in southern Lebanon.
I wanted to ask you about what you believe the trajectory for the United States' hegemony, as well as Israel's dream of hegemony. They call it Greater Israel in the region. These comments made by Donald Trump today about his reactions to the fact that he's claiming NATO and many U.S. allies are refusing to help in the latest iteration of this war.
This just in, President Trump on Truth Social saying we no longer need or desire the NATO countries' assistance. We never did. Likewise, Japan, Australia, or South Korea. In fact, speaking as president of the United States of America, by far the most powerful country anywhere in the world, we do not need the help of anyone. News Nation's Joe on this.
So that was his reaction to the fact, and he made other comments at this defense forum, defense industry forum in Pennsylvania, saying something to the effect of South Korea is not helping us despite U.S. troops being stationed there and in danger by North Korea and Kim Jong-un and all of this. But more importantly, to the notion of, you know, how is this war impacting the United States and Israel, who both have ambitions to be hegemonic, to be all powerful, to expand their power? Is that what's happening here?
Let me just start by saying that the argument that the United States doesn't need allies is ludicrous. I mean, the United States considers China to be the principal threat on the planet. The United States is deeply committed to pivoting to Asia for the purposes of containing China. The idea that we don't need allies to do that, I suppose if President Trump had been the head of the United States in the late 1940s and 1950s, he would not have created NATO because he didn't think he needed allies to contain the Soviet Union. This is not a smart argument. In fact, it's nonsensical. So it's just another one of those statements that President Trump has made that makes you really wonder what he is thinking about how the world works. With regard to the U.S. and Israel, I think there's no question that Israel was bent on being the dominant power in the Middle East. And doing everything it could to weaken all its potential adversaries, or if not weaken them, make them dependent on the United States. As we know well, both Egypt and Jordan, and even now Syria, are heavily dependent on the United States, which works to Israel's advantage, for sure. We also know that Israel would like to see countries, big countries in the region, greatly weakened. There's no question that Israel was not simply interested in regime change in Iran. They really wanted to break Iran into pieces. They wanted to greatly weaken Iran so that Israel was militarily much more powerful than Iran. And as many people have observed, the Israelis are now talking about Turkey as a major threat. Well, Turkey's another one of those big countries in the greater Middle East. And unsurprisingly, the Israelis have their gun sights now on Turkey. And this is all part and parcel of Israel's interest in becoming a regional hegemon, dominating the Middle East. This is not going to happen. And if anything, the Iran war has done an enormous amount of damage to Israel's pursuit of that vision, because Iran is going to come out of this war much more powerful than it was on February 27th. From the point of view of Israel, this war, the war between Iran on one side and the United States and Israel on the other side, has been a strategic disaster. No goals have been achieved. Iran now controls the Strait of Hormuz. And if a final deal is worked out, Iran will get all sorts of economic benefits that will help it grow its power in the future. So the idea that Israel is going to be a regional hegemon is no longer even possible. And of course, the Turks are not going to let that happen either. The idea that Israel is going to weaken Turkey, do great damage to Turkey, I believe is not in the cards either. With regard to the United States, I think the interesting question is whether or not the United States will stay in the Middle East, and specifically, will it stay in the Persian Gulf once this war comes to an end? The question is, will we think it makes strategic sense to rebuild our bases in places like Bahrain and Kuwait and so forth and so on? And moreover, will those 6 GCC countries want us there, given that we created this war that has led to a tremendous amount of destruction in each of their countries? It's not clear they'll want our bases there. So it remains an open question what happens to America's bases in the region and America's alliance structure in the region. All this is a way of saying that from an American and especially from an Israeli point of view, this war has been a disaster.
Now, there's an audience member's question I did want to ask. People have been very curious on your opinions on what the role of China is right now in the U.S. Iran war. You know, there have been many theories about what China is doing. Some have said that China is even, pushing Iran to lay off certain targets, to not escalate, to maybe be more amenable to negotiations. I haven't seen any evidence of that. I know you've traveled to China several times. I've been several times. I've never seen any evidence that that's something that would be necessarily in their interest. But nonetheless, there are interests here for China in terms of stability. So I'm wondering what your opinion is, if you have any insight into what China's role in this conflict is right now, if any.
Yeah, well, I don't know exactly what Chinese policymakers are thinking about Iran, but it does seem clear to me that Iran, Russia, and China are all mortal enemies of the United States. I'm choosing my words carefully here. I think that the United States is interested in seriously damaging all 3 of those countries. And I think when you're in a situation like that, situation that Iran, China, and Russia are in, you have a deep-seated interest in working together to make sure that you stymie the United States. China has a deep-seated interest, for example, in making sure that the United States does not defeat the Russians in Ukraine. Furthermore, both Russia and China have a deep-seated interest in making sure that the United States loses in its war against Iran. It would be to their advantage for sure. And therefore, you see all sorts of evidence that the Iranians are receiving important kinds of intelligence from both the Chinese and the Russians. There are all sorts of reports of Chinese and Russian weapons being sent to the Iranians, because again, the Chinese and the Russians don't want to see Iran lose. And of course, Iran has a deep-seated interest in working with China and Russia as well. To take this a step further, because the question had mainly to do with China, if you're China and you're worried about having the United States in your backyard, having the United States in your face, if you're worried about the United States pivoting to Asia to contain you, the idea that the United States gets sidetracked by launching a war in the Middle East that turns into a protracted war is wonderful news. The war in Iran has caused the United States to pivot away from East Asia so that it has sufficient forces in the Persian Gulf to fight against Iran. This is manna from heaven for the Iranians. For the Chinese. So the Chinese, in a very important way, have a vested interest in not only seeing the war, not only seeing the United States lose the war, but seeing the war go on and on, because it pins the United States down in the Middle East. So I think the net effect of this war is a win for China.
Yeah, which always made me curious about, some have noted that perhaps, China has a very good relationship with Pakistan, and some have noted that maybe it would be China through Pakistan pushing for negotiations and pushing for an end to the war. But at the same time, Pakistan itself has a deep interest in not having this war spiral out of control, not least because it's balancing relations with Iran, and the fact that even just today, there were top military leaders saying that if Iran attacks Saudi Arabia, for example, if this energy tit for tat, the infrastructure for infrastructure actually goes through, then Pakistan may be actually compelled to follow their military to military agreement that Saudi Arabia and Pakistan have. So I think, I'm curious on your response to this, that sometimes I feel like people maybe dismiss the role of even these intermediaries like a Pakistan, which has interests of its own and is actually in the region, unlike China, which is still not in the region, despite its interest, as you said, deep interest in ensuring that, or at least deep interest in allowing the United States to continue on its, foray and endless war in this part of the world.
Well, I think the question you have to ask yourself, Danny, is what would Pakistan gain by coming into a fight between Saudi Arabia and Iran? Let's assume the Iranians attack Saudi Arabia and the Saudis retaliate, and you have a significant tit for tat campaign between the two of them. There's no question the Americans are going to side with the Saudis. So it's not like the Saudis are going to be left out in the cold. The Saudis will have American support. What's the value added from Pakistan's point of view of getting involved? I mean, are they going to tip the balance against Iran? I don't think so. Are they going to matter very much in terms of who wins the fight? I don't think so. And are they going to cause themselves a lot of headaches in the sense that they're going to alienate the Iranians? I think the answer is yes. And therefore, I think if I'm playing Pakistan's hand and a fight breaks out between Saudi Arabia and Iran, I do not want to get involved. It's not in my strategic interest, and I'm talking here from a Pakistani point of view. So I don't see that happening.
And given you noted that Iran, Russia, and China are very connected here in terms of U.S. Ambitions and aims, I'm curious on your thoughts about how this current iteration of the war on Iran, how that affects the other flashpoints in the world, in particular Ukraine, because the United States has rhetorically seemingly turned an eye away from it, but that war is still very much raging, and the trajectory of it, I don't see having changed all that much, despite the fact, or at all, despite the fact that there's been, I think, a massive media spin attempting to frame it as now Russia on the back foot. So I'm curious if you believe that this ongoing Iran war will impact what's happening with Ukraine and other parts of the geopolitical map.
Well, I think that when you talk about the Ukraine war, you have to separate what's happening on the battlefield from this long-range drone campaign that the Ukrainians are waging against the Russian homeland. I think if you look at what's happening on the battlefield, I think the Russians are winning. I think the Ukrainians are in trouble. And I think there's no question that the Russians are not winning quickly. It's a slow victory. There's no question about that. But the Russians are slowly rolling up the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians have huge manpower problems, which is affecting their performance on the battlefield. And all evidence tells us that they're not able to solve the manpower problem, which is just getting worse because the draft resistance problem is increasing inside of Ukraine itself. So I think in terms of the battlefield, the Russians are on the march. It's the long-range drone war that Ukraine is waging with help from the Europeans and the United States against the Russians that most people in the West and in Ukraine see as Ukraine's ace in the hole. This is how Ukraine can get a favorable outcome to the war. And if you look at what President Trump said and how he acted in France in mid-June at the G7 meeting, and then you look at what he said and how he acted in early July at the NATO meeting in Ankara, it looks like President Trump has recommitted himself to trying to do great damage to Russia with this drone campaign. President Trump seems to be very enthusiastic about this long-range drone campaign that the Ukrainians are waging against Russia, and he wants to support it. If you look at the declaration that the G7 issued, this was on June 17th, after the meeting in France, what the G7 countries said, and of course this includes the United States and President Trump, was that what we're going to do is we're going to accelerate. Just think about that word. We're going to accelerate our efforts to help Ukraine wage the long-range drone war. Furthermore, it said that we were going to continue to push hard to do more damage to the Russian economy. This clearly signifies to me that President Trump is still in the fight against Russia in Ukraine. You remember last August 2025, this was during his first year in office, he went to Anchorage where he met Putin, and it looked like Russia and the United States were going to have some sort of major rapprochement as a result of this meeting in Anchorage. And that continued to be the case through most of 2025. But if you look at what's happened in 2026, especially what's happened at the G7 meeting, at the NATO meeting, it looks to me like President Trump has done pretty much a 180-degree turn. And this tells you that this one is going to be settled on the battlefield. There, I think the Russians are going to win. And that then leaves open the question, what happens if the drone war really begins to have a serious effect on the Russian economy and on Russian public opinion? What will the Russians then do? Will they escalate? How will they escalate? This is a huge question. And all of this just tells you that we have two ongoing wars, one in Ukraine and one in the Middle East that could have disastrous consequences.